Mark Torres is the author of Long Island Migrant Labor Camps, Dust for Blood, published in 2021, as well as two crime novels, A Stirring in the North Fork in 2015 and Adeline in 2019, and a labor union-related children's book titled Good Guy Jake. Mark is also a labor and employment attorney who tirelessly represents thousands of unionized workers and their families throughout the greater New York area. His commitment to the labor movement spans more than 30 years. Mark has a law degree from Fordham University School of Law and a bachelor's degree in history from NYU. He is currently an adjunct professor of labor studies at Hofstra University, and we're very happy to host Mark today as he speaks about his latest book, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, copies of which are on sale in the back. So please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Mark Torres.
Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming on a special Friday. I appreciate it, and especially would like to thank the Friends of the Library for scheduling this event, as well as Jeff and the Library Administration. And I'm here today to present my new book, Long Island and the Legacy of Eugenics, Station of Intolerance. And all of the information you'll hear today, you have to remember that the headquarters of the eugenic program was at Cold Spring Harbor, about 16 miles from where we sit today. And as we go through the program, I'm going to maybe remind you periodically to keep in mind how close we were to the proximity of the headquarters of this program that had such an impact throughout the world. So eugenics has been written about by many authors and historians. I don't make the claim this is a new topic per se, but it's never been told from the local perspective. And since the global headquarters of eugenics was at Cold Spring Harbor, a telling of this history from the local perspective was both critical and necessary, and this is the first book to do so. I take great pride, in fact, responsibility in fully researching all of my work. And a lot of my research took me to many places, including Cold Spring Harbor Laboratory and Archives on Long Island, the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, the Truman State University in Missouri, and many other locations, both in person and online archives. I've reviewed thousands of documents, articles, photos, personal correspondence. A lot of it was bland stuff, admittedly, but it was important to kind of get into the heads of the architects of this program to fully understand it and write about it competently. If I asked everyone in this audience to say if they've heard of eugenics, or more importantly, what they think it means, you'd probably get a lot of hands raised and a lot of mixed answers. And that's understandable, because the name alone kind of raises some questions more than answers. But eugenics itself was originally conceived in the 19th century. It was largely based on a theory that the best traits in humans can be engineered, sort of like breeding racehorses or raising sunflowers. It's not new. It was not a new idea. The quest to improve humanity is mentioned in ancient Greek, Roman, and Sanskrit writings. So it's certainly not a new topic to humanity, but certainly in the 19th century, the theories began to increase exponentially. Francis Galton, who is a cousin of Charles Darwin, is widely known as the father, or the founding father, of eugenics. He actually named the term eugenics, which is loosely defined as well-born. It was a kind of combination of Greek and English words that he used. And Galton was an English scientist. He developed the first weather maps and the use of fingerprints for forensic criminology. He was obsessed with numbers, patterns, and statistics, and his slogan was, "Wherever you can, count." Now, some of the other founding fathers, and you'll hear this name particularly throughout the presentation, was Thomas Malthus. He was an English economist who argued for strict population control. So you'll hear terms like Malthusian. It really largely comes from his theories. And one other individual named Johann Gregor Mendel. He was an Austrian biologist who really pioneered his work on hereditary traits of pea plants. Kind of just really a progression, but if you think of these founding fathers as the basics for the eugenics program to come. Now, there's generally known as two tracks of eugenics. The positive eugenics is the theory, the aspirational idea that human beings can be perfect race through proper and selective breeding. And I think if you ask any right-minded individual, wouldn't it be great if we can eliminate disease, illness, deformities at birth? I think everyone would say, yeah, that would be a great idea in theory. The problem is we know now, and I've always should have known, it's quite impossible. The negative eugenics, which is really a large part of this book focuses on, was the way to prevent those with so-called bad traits from having children and ultimately eliminating them from society. This included the poor, the mentally and physically disabled, and the morally undesirable citizens. And to quote historian Nathaniel Comfort, the problem with utopias is that they establish a set of aspirations that then blind you to a certain set of consequences, and that can be dangerous. Now, scientists did not begin to understand or really crack, if you will, the gene code until the mid-1960s. So eugenics was largely based on assumptions. That's all they could have done. Now, typically, the scientific method of research, scientists test a theory by asking questions and conducting experiments to either prove or disprove the theory. That's the way it should be, right? Eugenicists practice this in reverse. They already had their theory, their preconceived theory, a notion of heredity, largely premised on racist and classist beliefs. And they would seek to amass the data to support that preconceived theory. So for instance, if you had a married couple and say the husband was a known thief and the wife was an alcoholic, eugenicists would theorize that any children they had, they would automatically receive this genetic inheritable traits. And then it would automatically be passed on to their children. That was their belief. Of course, it ignored any legitimate socioeconomic factors that could have led to problems in their lives. Now, today, we hear terms like moron and idiot and imbecile, and they're general insults. But 100 years ago, these were legitimate medical diagnoses largely used by eugenicists. You see on the slide here with this kind of the escalating scale from the lowest to the idiot up to the moron. These are, again, medical diagnoses. Now, collectively, there was a term called feeble-minded. And I remember that term. You'll hear that as well throughout this presentation. Feeble-mindedness was a catch-all diagnosis that combined mental deficiency, if a person had it, with immorality. And that was dangerous to put those two together because then many people would kind of get lumped up into this group and then dealt with through harsh eugenic measures. So it's kind of a catch-all label, feeble-mindedness. Now, I mentioned earlier that eugenics largely was theorized and contemplated in the 19th century. But make no mistake, the true practice of eugenics was developed in America. It was made in America, and it was largely led by one man, Charles Benedict Davenport. He was a true architect of the American eugenics program, born in Connecticut, lived on Long Island, a Harvard-educated biologist and teacher. Now, Davenport was no simple biologist. He, by all accounts, was a genius. He was a leading biologist in an era that biology made phenomenal advances. He was the guy on top of this cutting edge of biology. Davenport was influenced by Mendel's work on hereditary work on pea plants and Galton's statistical numbering counting mind. His goal was to prove that heredity worked the same way in humans as it did with plants and animals. Now, he defined eugenics as the science of human improvement by better breeding. Davenport believed that the U.S. was destined to become a pure master race, and he argued that eugenics was the only way to achieve this goal. In 1902, Davenport traveled to England with his wife to meet Francis Galton, and it was more than just a meeting. What he was soliciting was an endorsement, something from, the founding father of eugenics to support him on his quest in the American program. And Galton furnished him with a letter, and that letter really gave a strong sponsorship for Davenport to go forward when he came back to America. Harry Laughlin, born in Iowa, Princeton-educated biologist. He served as the superintendent of the Eugenics Record Office from 1910 to 1939. He, in essence, was second in command behind Charles Davenport. He worked directly with the U.S. Congress to pass strict immigration laws in the name of eugenics, and he developed a blueprint for eugenic sterilization laws across the United States. Henry Goddard, born in Maine, mathematician and psychologist, he was the director of the New Jersey Training School for Feeble-Minded Children at Vineland. There's that term again, feeble-minded. Now, Goddard, along with Davenport, really coined this term and perfected it to a point where feeble-minded was a well-known term that, again, combined mental deficiency with immorality. A quite dangerous combination that labeled millions of people in the name of the science. Goddard also developed the English version of the intelligence, the IQ test. And it was used widely by eugenicists around the world. In fact, Goddard's test was used in May of 1917 to test 1.7 U.S. Army recruits across military camps throughout the United States. Based on their findings, more than half of the groups were declared morons. Now, eugenicists pounced on this. Look at this, we're failing, our military's failing. But the test itself was, of course, flawed and biased. They were asking soldiers questions that they had no way of knowing they could answer. Many of them were farm boys, and they never really had proper schooling or education. But on the test, they were asked questions about technology and fine art. Of course, they had no way of knowing these answers, and when they got them wrong, it was used against them to mark their, quote, intelligence. Mary Harriman, born in Rochester, New York, the widow of Mr. E.H. Harriman, a wealthy railway mogul who donated the Harriman State Park up in New York State, upstate. Upon his death, Mrs. Harriman inherited $100 million, close to $3.7 billion in today's money. Extremely wealthy. She was a staunch eugenicist who lent tremendous financial support to Davenport and the entire eugenic program. She even bought an 80-acre tract of land in Cold Spring Harbor and paid for the construction of the Eugenics Record Office building. And of course, the Carnegie Institute, more of on a national level, established in Washington in 1902 to encourage investigation, research, and discovery, a pioneer of science. Well, they also provided tremendous resources and funding for the eugenics program in America and later in Nazi Germany. So if you look at Davenport's tract here, he establishes this relationship and sponsorship from Galton. He gets a second in command in Harry Laughlin, who's kind of a evangelical type mouthpiece for the program. Henry Goddard helps him expand eugenic diagnoses. And he gets lucrative funding locally from Mary Harriman and the Carnegie Institute and even the Rockefellers later on. At that point, the eugenics program in America was launched. Now, if you remember nothing else from this program, I would urge you to understand that eugenics was not a fringe, small, quack local movement. It was widely embraced throughout the country and the world. I like to term it as it was the rage of the age. Eugenics was taught in nearly 300 colleges across the United States, including Yale, all the big Ivy League schools, Harvard, NYU, and others. It was widely embraced by doctors and scientists. It was openly supported from every president, from Theodore Roosevelt to Herbert Hoover. Eugenics even had religion involved, where there were eugenic sermon and essay contests. Many books, both scholarly and for entertainment, were written about eugenics, and it was popularized in popular culture, movies, commercial advertisements, newspaper advertisements. And eugenics had an amazing ability to run parallel with many of the social causes of the time. Birth control, vision, all these movements that kind of ran parallel with eugenics and sometimes intersected with each other. And among some of the prominent people that you may not have known were eugenicists, of course, Alexander Graham Bell was one, W.E.B. Du Bois was a staunch eugenicist, and even Helen Keller was a eugenicist. We talked about its ability to infect and run parallel with movements. Well, certainly the birth control movement at the time was a large issue. And Margaret Sanger, who was the leader of the American birth control movement, she too was a strong supporter of eugenics, and she's written several extremely racist books, and one like The Pivot of Civilization and whatnot. If you read these books, you'd be alarmed perhaps of the vitriol. But what's interesting about Sanger and her movement was that she believed in Malthusian. She believed in total population control. So she believed, let's sterilize across the board so we limit the amount of people on this planet. Eugenicists said, hold on. We want to sterilize the poor, the weak, the people of color, the minorities, the sick, the downtrodden. But the rich, the elite, let's leave them alone. So that kind of set a rift between Sanger as an individual and her organization with eugenicists, although they did support each other throughout the program. The Black Stork, a popular eugenic film that it was in 1917. It features a doctor who counsels a fictionalized couple to not have a child because it would likely be, quote, defective. This film ran in theaters for 10 consecutive years, and it was widely viewed and heavily popularized. On a national level, eugenicists, they had many events, including it's sort of like a World's Fair in California in 1915. The eugenic exhibit there was visited by 18 million people over a 9-month period. And in the Midwest, they had fitter family contests and other exhibits where families would dress up and they would show up at these booths and they would take measurements and vie for the, quote, fittest families. And they would get contest awards and governor's trophies from the mayor and the governor, hugely contested. And this was really build in the Midwest because of their known interest in farming and agriculture. So again, it synonymized that, and it was a huge interest and a huge draw that eugenics kind of went with those programs as well. So we talked about the theory, we talked about the foundations, but now there is a practice, and that practice did begin on Long Island at Cold Spring Harbor. The North Shore of Long Island, it's a former whaling port. It's lush with flora and fauna and perfect for scientific research. In 1890, the Brooklyn Institute of Arts and Sciences opened a state-of-the-art biology lab there to study birds, plants, goats, cats, etc. In 1898, Davenport was appointed the director of this program. In 1904, the Carnegie Institute leased a 10-acre tract of land, and they opened what was called the Carnegie Station for Experimental Evolution, cutting-edge science and research. And all of it was placed under the control of Charles Davenport. Now, Davenport made no secrets about what his intentions were. At a press release, he stated, "The problem of the origin of species has taken quite a new form in the half-century since Darwin's epoch-making work appeared. The work of the station is not therefore to confirm Darwin, but to go much farther than Darwin did." The Eugenics Record Office opened at Cold Spring Harbor in 1910 with lucrative funding from Mary Harriman. And it was really, it was in operation for just under almost 30 years. But the ERO really served fundamentally as the headquarters for the eugenics program. The work conducted here in this small, unassuming looking two-story building really led the way and had a direct and negative impact on human history throughout the 20th century and beyond. It was essentially serving as a database, a data source. Millions of index cards, family charts, and other pedigree documents were stored here in special fireproof cabinets, state-of-the-art stuff for its time at the ERO. The data was used to support and amplify the eugenics program and movement. Now, here at ERO, they also published what was called the Eugenical News, sort of a quarterly newspaper pamphlet. Think of it as the Twitter of the time. They would get all this eugenic information throughout the world, publish it, and send it back out into mass. And it was widely distributed across the world. And a lot of these still are in the records and archives. And again, it's all based on the eugenics of the day, the ongoings, the special events, announcements, things of that sort. Now, the ERO developed a robust training program for field workers, who were mostly female and mostly college-educated students. Between 1911 and 1924, an estimated 250 field workers were hired. They were paid $75 a month, and they had to commit to work a minimum of 1 year in the field. They traveled the country to interview families, patients, prisoners, and so forth, with biased questionnaires aimed at labeling people as socially defective. And all these records were retrieved and brought back to the ERO for review. So now you have a practice in place. What's the plan? Well, we don't have to guess because they tell us what their plan is. So starting in July of 1911, members of the eugenics section of the American Breeders Association met at the City Club in 45th Street in Manhattan. They had several meetings ongoing. Charles Davenport, Harry Laughlin, and many preeminent doctors, scientists, Nobel Peace Laureates, other leading professionals and leading thinkers of the time were all in attendance at these meetings. Harry Laughlin, at the request of Davenport, drafted the plans in a special report. And this committee discussed the best ways to deal with 10% of the US population, 15 million Americans, who they deemed were socially defective. They had a name for them. They called them the submerged tenth. So they came up with a 10-part plan to deal with them. Among that was life segregation in mental institutions during breeding years, marriage restriction, forced sterilization, and even mass murder. They contemplated the mass murder of 15 million Americans by as early as 1911. Now, you may ask, who are these? Who are these people? Well, they itemized that too. They came up with a list of 10 groups. 1, the feeble-minded, which again could be a catch-all for so many. 2, the poor. 3, alcoholics. 4, criminals of any crime. 5, epileptics. 6, the insane. 7, the physically weak class, the aesthetic class they call them. 8, those prone to specific diseases. 9, the deformed. And 10, those with defective sensory organs, the blind, deaf, and the mute, which makes it even more shocking that Helen Keller would have been a staunch eugenicist. She clearly would have been on this list. So now they have a plan in place. Now the hunt begins, and I call it the pedigree hunters. And they were hunting, looking for this submerged tent to kind of fortify and identify and itemize who these people were. So eugenicists went to mental asylums, prisons, poorhouses, Native American tribal lands, poor rural areas, even Coney Island circus shows, the so-called freak shows. They went there, and again, to build on the science and get this data. Now, you may ask, well, how did they have such access? Now, you have to remember, Charles Davenport was a revered scientist, highly connected in a burgeoning science that was billed as cutting edge. There was no pushback. Davenport and his team had access to all of these facilities. In fact, he once wrote to the American Museum of Natural History to request two skulls of Shinnecock Indians they had in their archives. Sure, no problem, sent it right over. These were the days before HIPAA and privacy records. They had access to everything, unfettered. And again, why? To identify, target, and eliminate the socially defective class. Some of the places they went to was Pilgrim State Hospital in Brentwood, the State Custodial Institution in Rome, New York, where most of the eugenic sterilizations in New York took place in that 8-year window between 1912 and 1920. Kings Park was one of their favorite locations to visit. On the shores of Long Island Sound, it was operation from 1885 to 1993. At its peak, it had over 150 buildings with 9,300 patients. It was a self-sufficient facility with livestock, fire station, power plant, its own maintenance buildings, and even a railroad station that led right to the facility. Again, as wherever else, eugenicists were given wide, full access to study the patients here and their records. Coney Island. Obviously, the late 19th century, popular to the so-called freak shows. Many of these performers had legitimate concerns, and they were certainly exploited, and some of them actually exploited as well. They perfectly knew the game, and they lived quite a lucrative lifestyle, some of them. But many of these performers, all of them mostly, had legitimate conditions which led to their appearance. Despite the exploitation that was going on. So upper right corner, you see Lionel, half man, half lion. In reality, he had hypertrichosis, a condition which produced excessive facial hair and body hair. And Tony, on the left, the alligator skin boy, he had ichthyosis, a condition that leaves tough rectangular skins on the body. Now, eugenicists would go here and make these studies, and they would, again, fearmonger. Look at this. We're all going to be like this if we don't have eugenics to save humanity. And again, in an age where there was no popular access to information to push back on this, and these are the leading scientists of the age, many of them, it was really an effective tool for them to kind of continue in promoting the science. Letchworth Village up in Rockland County. Davenport particularly spent an enormous amount of time up here. They conducted many studies and also experiments. In August 1929, Davenport and two doctors castrated a 13-year-old boy with Down syndrome. They wanted to study the tissue of the castrated testicle for eugenic purposes. And of course, the tests were inconclusive. Now, the boy's mother was also disabled, so there's really high doubt that they received proper consent to conduct this gruesome experiment on the boy. But nonetheless, they did so, and there was no pushback against it. With the data, eugenicists wanted to create both the good traits and the bad traits. Theodore Roosevelt, who was a very staunch eugenicist, openly as well, they would study his family and make this family tree and say, this is what we should all aspire to. Look at the perfect genealogies. On the opposite side, they would show negative traits to show what we should be afraid of. On the left, 4 generations in one almshouse at one time at Yaphank. This is a poorhouse up in Yaphank, New York. And here you see a family of 4 people who were at this facility. And the notion that they have poor genes totally discounts the fact that there could be many reasons why they were there in poverty at this location. On the right, a chart purported to show the hereditary predisposition to mental illness. Eugenicists use these elaborate tools to kind of embellish and heighten the practice. An abacus on the left, it was used to determine the structure of human chromosomes. And on the right, the mechanism of Mendelian hereditary. It looked so fancy, and it was meant to, purportedly, to show how chromosomes carry gene traits. Again, well before the genes, really hereditary science was truly understood. So these were more or less props that kind of used to, again, promote eugenics. The ERO published many reports on data they collected. One of them on the right here, 1920, Crime and Race Descent, was meant to show the racial profiles of U.S. prisoners in comparison to other prisoners in other countries. Now, the idea of national policy was always on the radar for eugenicists, and they kind of fed off each other, right? The movements with eugenicists and kind of went along. So several states passed eugenic-based laws restricting people with physical and mental disabilities from getting married. The laws encouraged others to report their fellow citizens. In Virginia, the Racial Integrity Act of 1924 was passed. It was led by a staunch eugenicist named Walter Plecker. The law prohibited the marriage of any white person to another person with even, quote, one drop of non-Caucasian blood. And they checked all the records. Plecker had access and was part of the Census Bureau in the state and had access to all the records of it. Violators of the law faced fines, imprisonment, and even nullified marriages. One of the largest movements for eugenicists was immigration restriction. Between 1880 and 1920, more than 20 million immigrants came to the U.S., 8 million alone between 1900 and 1909. Harry Laughlin was enlisted by Congress as an expert eugenic agent to make several eugenic presentations. Of course, they were largely fueled by racist and xenophobic writings, to help pass the Emergency Immigration Restriction Act of 1921. This cut immigration from Eastern European countries by nearly 2/3. Just 3 years later, Congress passed the Immigration Act of 1924, and this restricted access from many countries to as low as 3%. This largely, this belief, although cannot confirm, that Otto Frank and his family were caught up in this prevention, but even if they weren't directly, as you could see, many were. Down 97% cut from many of these countries, again, led by racist, xenophobic, and eugenic data. Now, at the time, we talk about the immigration movements. The southern border today was Ellis Island. And there was a huge fervor and anti-immigration sentiment in the U.S., led by one man, including Madison Grant. He was a lawyer, author, conservationist, and zoologist. Now, Grant, he was a notorious racist and a eugenicist. He wrote a book called The Passing of the Great Race in 1916. In it, he wrote that whites were the master race facing extinction, and he openly criticized and complained about all races entering the U.S., Jews, Italians, Polish, Irish, and so forth. Hitler read this book while he was in prison, and he called it, quote, his Bible. Now, Grant coined the term the Nordic race, much like the Nazis later with the Aryan race. These were fictionalized races purporting to show the best version of the white race. Now, Grant was a staunch eugenicist and closely aligned with the ERO. And in fact, in 1920, Charles Davenport wrote Grant a letter, and in that letter he said, quote, "Can we build a wall high enough around this country to keep out these cheaper races?" Now, eugenicists believed that mass sterilization was the fastest, surest, and cheapest way to prevent these defective populations from increasing. As of January 1921, there were just over 3,000 eugenic sterilizations performed. When I say eugenic sterilizations, they were forced. People were strapped down, forced to go into this procedure for eugenic purposes. And it was across 15 states that had laws at the time, largely led by California, Nebraska, Oregon, Indiana, Wisconsin, and even New York. But for eugenicists, this was too slow. In 1922, Harry Laughlin wrote a book entitled Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. This book really was a model sterilization statute or law that other states can use to literally copy and enact in their states to sterilize people against their will based on eugenics. Now, these laws are being struck down, and it was unconstitutional, and eugenicists were incredibly frustrated. So they needed a test case. They needed something that they could bring to the High Court, the United States Supreme Court, that will pass muster. Enter Carrie Buck. 19 years old, she was born in Charlottesville, Virginia, to a poor family that was forced to place her into foster care. In 1924, she got pregnant out of wedlock, but in essence, she was raped. And her foster parents were enraged and had her committed to the Virginia Colony for Epileptics and Feeble-Minded. There's that term again, feeble-minded. A short time later, Carrie gave birth to a daughter named Vivian. Now, the colony who was holding her believed that she, her mother, and her daughter Vivian were all feeble-minded. So they wanted to sterilize Carrie. This became their test case to test the constitutionality of the law. Now, prior to the case, which became known as Buck v. Bell, the prosecutors contacted the ERO on Long Island, 16 miles from where we sit, and they asked for help. And Harry Laughlin could not attend in person, but he was more than happy to help by preparing trial documents and written sworn statements and testimony. And although he never met Carrie or Emma or Vivian, Laughlin swore that they were all feeble-minded. He also dispatched a man by the name of Arthur Estabrook, a researcher from the ERO, to testify as an expert witness at the trial. He never met Vivian Buck, but he, in court, testified and swore that she was feeble-minded. She was 8 months old. Laughlin also assisted in the drafting of appeals and for the later cases. He was actively involved in this case. November of 1924, Carrie's first trial began. Irving Whitehead was her first court-appointed lawyer. He failed to provide a legal defense for Carrie and corrupted the case. For instance, he failed to object or challenge to any of the evidence being submitted against her, even though he had ample time to do so. His questions assisted the case against her, and he had a relationship with the state's attorneys without disclosing it. I submit to you, and I'm a practicing attorney, any one of these could and should have me disbarred if I did these. He did all three comfortably. In February of 1925, the lower court ruled that, yes, the colony can sterilize Carrie Buck. But of course, that wasn't the plan. They wanted to kick it up to the next levels. So the case was appealed, but all of the evidence submitted at the lower court was in. It was evidence. It was considered fact. So any appeals court that would hear the case were only looking at a question of law. Can we do this? Can we not? Does it violate the Constitution? In the spring of 1927, the case was brought before the U.S. Supreme Court. Buck v. Bell. In an 8-1 decision, the Supreme Court ruled that the state of Virginia could sterilize Carrie Buck against her will based upon eugenics. This decision has never been reversed. Reading from Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who wrote the decision for the court, it is better for all the world if instead of waiting to execute degenerate offspring for their crime, or to let them starve for their imbecility, society can prevent those who are manifestly unfit from continuing their kind. 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Now, this decision was, and if you've ever read Supreme Court decisions, they're quite lengthy. This was only 5 paragraphs in length. Later in life, Justice Holmes told a friend that the Buck v. Bell was one decision that I wrote that gave me pleasure. Now, what's interesting about it, particularly with the last sentence, where they label 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. Now, Carrie was declared by the colony who was holding her to be a middle-grade moron. A clear distinction from imbecile. But for the court, it didn't matter. Imbecile, moron, same thing. It had no defect in their decision. But also the notation of 3 generations of imbeciles. Daughter, youngest daughter, mother, grandmother. If you remember the slide I showed you earlier at Yaphank, the 4 generations in one almshouse, that verbiage did come from the ERO. So they had direct ties to the, not only influence of the court, but even the decision writing itself. On October 19, 1927, Carrie Buck was sterilized. She was 21 years old. A few years later, her daughter Vivian died tragically of an intestinal infection following the measles, contracting the measles. Now, prior to Buck v. Bell, there were just over 3,000 eugenic sterilizations. After that decision was rendered from the 30s through the 60s, there were more than 60,000 eugenic sterilizations in the U.S. By far, the largest numbers in California, North Carolina, and Virginia. On tribal lands, there were between 25 and 50% of Native American women were sterilized. In Puerto Rico, up to 20,000 women in one town alone were sterilized, and by 1965, 1/3 of the women on the island between the ages of 25 to 49, the prime breeding years, were sterilized. How far does it go? Well, sadly, there was killing in the name of eugenics. On November 12th, 1915, a woman gave birth in Chicago Hospital to a child with a deformity and extreme abnormalities. The chief surgeon, Dr. Harry Hazelton, was summoned, and he saw the child. He refused to treat the child, and he purposely let the child die. Why? His belief in eugenics made that decision. He was investigated and cleared of all wrongdoing, and instead of resting on his laurels, he celebrated his decision to let the child die, and he went on a national tour in promotion of eugenics. In fact, his story partly inspired the production of the Black Stork movie. The Illinois Institution for the, there it is again, Feeble-Minded. At this facility, which, by the way, Hazelton himself called a slaughterhouse, windows are purposely left open and without screens so patients would face cold drafts in the winter and swarming insects in the warm weather. Patients were reportedly given milk from cows that were infected with tuberculosis. Studies showed the death rate here was as high as 30%. Now, the man on the right, Judge Harry Olson, he condemned many patients at this facility. He was a known eugenicist. He was the president of the Eugenic Research Association, and he even helped publish Harry Laughlin's book, Eugenical Sterilization in the United States. I would submit to you that this was killing in the name of eugenics. Now, we talk locally, nationally, but eugenics was extremely popular globally. Now, the ERO helped spread eugenics all over the globe. Belgium, Canada, Denmark, England, Finland, France, Italy, Norway, Romania, Sweden, and Switzerland all had and adopted eugenic policies and mass sterilization programs. In 1929, Davenport led a team. There was a meeting held in Rome, Italy, with international eugenicists, sort of like the counterpart for each country. And there, at that meeting, of course, they took the time to craft a wonderful letter to Mussolini, who was in charge at the time, but they also had a bigger goal. They created a world atlas of each country's defective populations. Why? To target and eliminate, to identify, target, and eliminate eventually the eugenically unfit in each country. These men were playing God at this point. Now, the U.S. Constitution provides and provided many guardrails. Obviously, they didn't go to the point of killing 15 million Americans and getting as far as it did, so there was some restraint. In Nazi Germany, there was no restraint. Hitler himself was avid about eugenics, although he once told a colleague that if his mother was given a eugenic questionnaire, he's pretty sure that he would not have been born, meaning she would have been sterilized. Even he understood the fallacies and dangers of the eugenic program, but of course, being who he was, he fully embraced it. Now, the Germans and the American eugenic programs were closely aligned. German eugenics was led by a man named Otto von Verscher. He was the director of the Institute for Hereditary Biology and Race Hygiene in Frankfurt, Germany. In 1934, Verscher's work was cited by the American Medical Association, and he was lauded for his work by American eugenicists across the board. He was directly connected with Davenport and the ERO. He joined the advisory board of the Eugenical News, and Davenport arranged for a delegation of Nazi eugenicists to attend Harvard's 300th anniversary in 1936. Now, Verscher, like Davenport, was eager to expand his work on eugenics. Eventually, this culminated with the law passed in 1934, where 56,000 German citizens, I want to emphasize, this is well before the Holocaust. These German citizens were targeted and sterilized in a law that targeted as many as 400,000 citizens. In 1935, Verscher hired a young assistant to help him carry out the program. That young assistant was Joseph Mengele, later became known as the Angel of Death. In 1943, Verscher sent Mengele to Auschwitz, and some of his gruesome acts included. He sewed the wrists and backs of twin boys to simulate Siamese twins. He killed people and performed immediate autopsies, quote, while the bodies were still warm. He removed the patient's stomach without anesthesia. He dissected body parts and sent them back to Verscher for further study marked as urgent national defense. And he injected dye into the eyes of children, usually leaving them blind. In the summer of 1936, the Heidelberg University School of Medicine in Germany was celebrating its 550th anniversary. Carl Schneider, the dean of the school at the time, awarded Harry Laughlin of the ERO an honorary degree for his work on eugenics. He called Laughlin one of the most important pioneers in the field of racial hygiene. I'll draw your attention to the top right of the screen with the postage stamp, clearly with the Nazi swastika, and the middle of the screen directly sent to Laughlin Eugenics Record Office. One of the many damning, direct, and clear connections between the Nazi and American eugenicists that are discussed in the book. Now, just 3 years after this award, and these correspondences were written, Schneider served as a lead researcher to help organize the Nazi T4 program. This program, they used carbon monoxide at various killing locations throughout Germany and occupied Germany to lethally gas 70,000 German men, women, and children who were disabled or defective citizens. The victims were herded into large gas chambers, disguised as showers. Ashes and fake birth certificates were returned to the families to suggest the deaths were by accident. This has often been called the first Nazi genocide, and it served as the template for the Holocaust that would follow. And it all has ties to eugenics. After the war, and the doctor's trial in Nuremberg took place, Karl Brandt, Hitler's personal doctor, physician, and 22 other Nazi doctors stood trial for crimes against humanity. In their defense, they stated that they were directly inspired by the American eugenics program. They argued that in America, a Supreme Court case, Buck v. Bell, allowed for forced sterilization. And Laughlin's report, by as early as 1911, called for mass sterilization and euthanasia of millions of Americans. Their argument was, what do we do different than you're not doing? Brandt and 6 others were eventually convicted and hanged for their crimes. Both Mengele and Verscher never faced justice. What's it all for? Well, the Carnegie Institute, who was the main funders for the eugenics program for decades, could not ignore any longer the ongoing atrocities. In January of 1939, they sent a committee to review, for the first time, the millions of records stored at the ERO and determined that they were sloppily kept by untrained people, and they were rendered, quote, worthless for genetic study. Eugenics was deemed as speculative and not a true science. The ERO was officially closed later that year in December 1939, and all references to eugenics were permanently changed to genetics. The ERO was in operation for just under 30 years, but its policies lasted far longer than that. For Davenport, he himself retired in 1934, still remained active. He died on February 18, 1944 at 77 years old from a bronchial infection while conducting research on the skull of a whale that washed up on the shores of Long Island. Harry Laughlin died on January 26, 1943 at the age of 63. Now, among the many things he did for the eugenics program, he specialized in rooting out epilepsy. It was later discovered that he himself was an epileptic, a fact he long kept a secret. In the summer of 2020, president of the Carnegie Institute issued the following statement. There is no excuse then or now for our institution's previous willingness to empower researchers who sought to pervert scientific inquiry to justify their own racist and ableist prejudices. Our support of eugenics made us complicit in driving decades of brutal and unconscionable actions by governments in the United States and around the world. As president of the Carnegie Institute for Science, I want to express my sincere and profound apologies for this organization's past involvement in these horrific pseudoscientific activities. This apology was put on their website overnight in some idle day in June of 2020. No public statement, nothing beyond that. California, North Carolina, and Virginia would later pass reparations bills for victims who were sterilized by eugenics, but many of them had already died. The enduring legacy of eugenics. In 2002, the Netherlands became the first country to allow doctors to euthanize people with incurable illnesses. To date, nearly 60,000 people have been euthanized. A 2022 report released states that there are 31 states in the US that still allow for forced sterilization of people with disabilities, including California, Florida, New York, and DC. US prison systems have been offering reduced sentencing if inmates agree to be sterilized. And in 2023, the FDA began to review technology that could produce artificial wombs for human beings. And some international companies have already developed artificial growth pods to simulate a womb, which can be monitored with smartphone technology. Now, I make no judgments on the legitimacy or need of such technology, but understanding the history of eugenics as I do, there is certainly a cause for concern. Eugenics had all the trappings of a science. But it was, in the end, it was nothing more than a social philosophy driven by racist and classist ideals, which were used to brand, condemn, and eliminate the poor, diseased, disabled, and less fortunate from our society. No one is perfect, and we each have our strengths and weaknesses, and we all bring something of value. Collectively, this is what makes human beings so special. For eugenicists, they can never accept this premise. I welcome any questions you may have. Yes.
Thank you so much, Mark. We'll get some lights up here and take some questions.
Obviously, we're all shell-shocked by what you see. I would like to, what do you think, how widespread is a belief in eugenics right now? And is it sort of under a different name? Is there something we should be aware of or looking for in what we read?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your question.
Can you just repeat the question?
Yeah, she was asking how widespread is eugenics today, and is it something we should be concerned about? Understanding that eugenics was a philosophy, not a science, and it's hard to kill or stop a philosophy. So when we hear public comments from public officials saying immigrants are ruining the blood of our nation, that's alarming. When we hear statements of that measure where, people of others have better genes than others, that should be alarming. So certainly when you tie that philosophy with the philosophy of anti-immigration or any other movement, it becomes much stronger, and they feed off each other. The good news, if there is that eugenics was billed as a science, and it was accepted by almost everyone as a science. Now we know scientifically it's been debunked. That does take some bite off that belief. But again, knowing the philosophy and the sentiment and people who want to have ill will and intolerance for others, it's scary. It certainly is scary, and it can be used in some way, shape, or form, but certainly not as a science, but in some measure of popular statements and comments. Yes?
Hi. I'm shocked by the extent of eugenics. A question. Are you making an equivalence between people's choice to end their own lives in the face of an incurable disease or something that's going to make themselves and their family suffer?
Yeah.
To eugenics?
The question is, am I making an equivalency for those who wish to end their own lives for medical reasons and others? And no, in short, no. And there are, like the Denmark laws, there are strict conditions for that, thankfully. And of course, if there's someone is in a condition where it's incurable and it's in suffering, where it's no hope and the family's suffering as much as so that's why I make no judgments on those needs. But when we talk about euthanasia, when we talk about sterilization, we have to be cautious overall based on this history, the legacy of eugenics. What if it falls into the wrong hands? If those strict rules become weaker, and then more people can be euthanized or sterilized, and it becomes more, instead of at their own choice, and more or less against their will. And that's where the caution is, where the slippery slope.
Yeah, another question back here.
It said 2002 in the Netherlands, 60,000 people were sterilized.
No, euthanized.
Euthanized.
But
based on what? Like, how did that get into to be effective?
Yeah.
I meant to say euthanized.
The question is the high number of euthanizations in Denmark, the Netherlands. Those were choice. And now the statute there, the laws there are very strict. So if someone is incurable, agonizing pain, no hope of treatment, there is a mechanism to do that where the person elects to have their life taken. So it's not against their will. The concern, though, is, as we discussed, is what if those strict criteria get weaker, and then more people can somehow slip through the cracks where maybe it's not what they want. Maybe there's confusion, and that's where the danger lies. So yes, it's a high mechanism for it, but it's the first nation in the world to have that. And again, given this history, that's the fear I have. Thank you. Yeah, that's right. It's a frightening proposition.
I think there was a doctor who fostered mercy killings, and by the sheerest coincidence, the vast majority of those who consented were women. I don't know whether that's significant.
Yeah, you know, it's scary. You know, there's no mistake with it. When you die, right? So what if there is a mistake? What if, you know, even in the courts and death penalty states that, you know, there at least certainly should be high bar to make sure this is what it's going to be. And, you know, you have to get it right. Do-overs. And it's the finality of it is the real risk. And if there's any room for error or manipulation, you know, like we've seen here, that's where the real risk comes. Yes.
You know, I have some experience with this professionally. And I have to say that I would say, from my own experience, just me, that the laws governing the ability to end your own life are actually too strict right now. I understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
In the wrong hands, it
Yes.
can be twisted around to exactly where you're going.
Yeah.
I won't mention any names, but there might be a person around right now in power.
Yeah.
Anyway, I mean, that's been my experience.
No, I agree. The question, the comment was that the laws governing this area may be too strict. And that may be true, and I don't disagree because, you know, we don't know the specifics of each condition. If someone is such an incurable way and maybe they don't have, I don't know, the proper doctors or attorneys who can help move along this process to get their wish, which is to die. And again, the clear distinction there is that's their wish. And there's a mechanism that they want to do it. Here, it was a whole different, and that's why I'm so cautious, because I respect and I don't question the legitimacy, and there's mechanisms. Knowing from this history how dangerously it was practiced and influenced, that's where the real risk comes. So I'm more of an alarmist in that regard, but I certainly respect if someone is in that incurable way and some of these laws are too strict preventing that person. That would be a shame, although, you know, you always want to favor life, but if that's really their wish and they're of sound mind and there's no other hope of getting better, then I would understand it. So, yes. Thank you.
So Mark, yes.
In 1922, my aunt was born with Down syndrome in Iowa. At that time, they didn't know about the condition. It was even called mongoloidism because of the slanted eyes that many children with Down syndrome have. 5 years later, my grandmother had surgery for what I've always been told was an unnecessary operation, and she died. Is there any way I could find out if she was trying to be sterilized, or it would fall within what you're talking about today, or is it just too long ago?
Well, you would have to check with the local records.
It's
I don't know.
100 years.
Yeah. Usually
Yeah.
records are by law, you know, there's a limitation on laws. I could only draw an assumption. First of all, thank you for sharing that. It's very painful. And one of the things about this presentation, it's not an easy one. It's heavy, and it brings a lot of pain overall, but personally too. So I really appreciate you sharing that. I'm sorry for that, what you went through. Knowing what I've studied, that sounds exactly what they probably would have wanted to do. See, a lot of the sterilizations took place, particularly with women of color who spoke different languages. They would tell them, well, it's reversible, it's a cleaning, it's no big deal, don't worry. Some people, there was a Native American woman in California who was sterilized, and she didn't even know she was sterilized. So her and her husband were trying to conceive a child, and the husband was a drinker. He got outraged. He thought it was infidelity. She was that she was shunned by the community. She committed suicide. And then later, she found out she was sterilized against her will, without even knowing. You know, these consent forms were in English, and she only knew Spanish. So there was a lot of things there that go forth for that. But the idea was, to eugenicists, if someone gave birth to someone with a disability or deformity, they likely would do it again. So they would not want to continue. They would want to sterilize people in that situation, so they would not continue to have children. And a lot of it, sadly, a lot of it is really rooted in economics. In English, 19th century and 20th century, they railed against, why are we paying for the poor? You know, we talk about so much about taxpayer dollars, right? And they railed against, why are we paying for them and them and them? And, you know, we should have more, and it's not fair. So it had an economic factor. And really, that was one of the consistent themes throughout eugenic presentations, writings, beliefs, that economic factor. We could save so much if we don't have these mental institutions, if we don't have these people. So it was largely driven by economics as well, overall philosophy of trying to improve human traits. But thank you so much for sharing that. I'm so sorry for.
Yes.
How would you say the proportion of sterilizations, men and women? Presumably it was the vast majority were women.
It was mostly women, but there were male too. In fact, New York State had 41 eugenic sterilizations. Now, I want to preface that with saying all of them, at least according to, and these are Laughlin's records, which he had no reason to lie. Laughlin stated all of those records were not eugenic. They weren't forced. They were agreed upon by the family and the patient and whatnot. So it was more of a thing, and the statute was dissolved. It was repealed 8 years later. Out of those 41, 40 of them were women and one was a male. But overall, predominantly women, but men as well. They had its across-the-board view of trying to prevent the spreading of the genes, the so-called defective germplasm, all these fancy terms they would use. And I am not a biologist, a scientist, I'm a lawyer, I'm educated in history. So it took me a while to kind of navigate through this. And I almost walked away. I said, this is pretty complex stuff. And then I realized, and I credit my wife for kind of saying, stick with it. That was part of the ruse. Make it so complex that people would just defer to the science, trust the experts, and do what they say. So I'm glad I stuck through to understand those terms and fight through on that.
So, Mark, I think, I think probably like many of us, I knew of eugenics. I knew that it was discredited. I felt like a long time ago. I had no idea the extent, that the broad influence that had, maybe still has. And I guess that's my question is, in terms of the movement or the philosophy being discredited, it seems like there was multiple times. So sort of 1939, there was an end to the ERO office. 1960s, there's DNA research that happens.
That's right.
But then we saw the statement that the Carnegie Institute put out in 2020.
Yeah.
So at what point was it discredited, and is it still discredited?
Well, look, the ERO's closure in 1939 officially is the official discrediting point. But it should have been a lot sooner. Davenport himself, again, he was this amazing scientist and biologist, clearly should have known that this was flawed. Henry Goddard, who helped him devise this feeble-minded term, he later realized and regretted that it was wrong, although kept it to himself. Thomas Hunt Morgan, a noted scientist and hereditary scientist who studied at Columbia, he was one of the early proponents of eugenics. He realized, now he studied fruit flies, and every 10 days fruit flies reproduce. They could kind of gauge traits and try to learn from that. He realized that we do this every 10 days, and we don't even have a chance. This is so complex. How are we making these assumptions for humans? So what he did was he walked away from the program, said, take my name off the letterhead, I'll walk away silently, and left. Never discredited. There was some pushback publicly, some scientists, some religions, Catholic religion and others. In fact, in Buck v. Bell, the 8-1 decision, the sole dissenting judge was the Catholic on the bench. But they were minority groups only. And we would have liked to have seen more people speak out then, as is now. But again, it was a different era. The ability to get information was more limited than it is now. And not, argue whether, notwithstanding any misinformation, but there was just little information that the lay person would have got. They trusted the science of the age. And when you have people, presidents and Supreme Court cases and doctors and TV ads, it was inescapable. It was the rage of the age. So it was really hard to go against. So the discrediting happened officially in 1939. It should have happened sooner. The old guard, the Davenports, they retired and died off, kind of went underground. It kind of resurfaced. There was in the late 60s, there was a talk about population control. And of all people, Nixon appointed Rockefeller to run that commission, who was also a staunch eugenicist. So the concern is, are we going to try to limit childbirth again? So these theories, these philosophies, yes, as a science, it was debunked, but the philosophy carried on. And anytime, it's hard to kill a philosophy. And that's the danger of it. But at the very least, the science of it, the authoritative view that this was a legitimate science was debunked at that time. And all the funding was pulled and the records were closed, and that's when the beginning of the end, if you will.
Another question.
Just one more thing to think about. Would it have been better or worse with social media?
What was the question?
Would it
The
be
whole eugenics philosophy spread.
social media?
Yeah.
Think
Well-
about how it might have been if
Yeah.
came now with social media.
Yeah, if your question is what would it be now with social media? And that's why I liken that eugenical news sort of like the Twitter of the time, right? You have something condensed, sanitized in their version, and sent back out to the world. It would have been much more dangerous. People would have sought to support something of this nature. But again, we study history and we look at it now because we're here now. 100 years ago, none of us were here, and we look at it and we say, how is it so different? And understanding the way it was then, the authority that it lent, the support that it got, it's understandable that this got as big as it did. And that's scary, knowing what we know now, even looking back. But that's what happened. And that's why it's important to kind of follow up with these works so that we look at the then and the nows and then do the comparisons of what could have been different. But yes, the social media component absolutely would have solidified it further. And they would have certainly had their own pages and social media accounts as well. Yes?
Yeah.
It's just an observation, but the debunking of science today gives more power to the philosophies that still exist.
Yeah, that's a great question. The debunking of science today leads to more. And look, I tend to agree. I think that people study things for years, whether you're a climatologist or an archaeologist or a mathematician. They have this ability to be called experts. The layperson don't have that ability. That doesn't mean you should totally trust, right? We saw what happens, the perils of just trusting the science completely here. You have to have some faith in others who've studied this. But yet, with social media and other things, it could be corrupted and it could form sides and people kind of forget truths and stick with a side more than anything else. And there's a danger to that too, of course. I think that we do have much more access to information. We also have access to misinformation. It's kind of a pick your poison mentality, right? But the idea is to try to be as competent in research as you can and really at least lead for the right reasons instead of taking a side saying, well, I have an interest here because my family's so-and-so or whatever it is, to have the right interest going in and trying to find out what the real truth is. So, and of course, we've made advancements with genetic and hereditary science, and that is a fact too.
Yeah. We have time for a couple more questions.
Okay, I just have sort of an observation. I want to say, first of all, that your presentation was horrifying. And as I listened to it, I felt almost bludgeoned by the facts that you were going at and how just horrible it was and that it happened in my lifetime, in the 1960s when I was a teenager. And it was shocking. And I think that if we look, I hope no one is offended, but at the rhetoric of some of our leading government officials today, we hear echoes of what you've been saying, and we have to think about that. And at the same time, something that was important to me that I'm getting from this is when I would always read about, for example, euthanasia and other kinds of political issues, and being, sort of on the left on most of them, I would think, well, these right-wingers, they're nuts. Look at these stupid objections they have. But now I have more of an understanding that some of their objections are based in the misuse and the horrible things that you told us about. Maybe I'll be a little more tolerant when I hear the objections of people I disagree with, and I want to thank you for that.
Oh, well, no, two things. One, thank you for your comments. I report history as I find it. I hold no punches. I appreciate that I horrified you, if I'm saying that right. I don't mean to scare, but I mean to tell the truth. And it's encouraged for you to learn, and if you're interested, to dig more. I get a lot from your questions as much as hopefully you get from my presentation, so thank you for that. Yes, one thing I'll say about eugenics and politics, right? We think of today's times. Everybody bought in politics. There was no left or right on this. Eugenics ruled the day. And that's very remarkable when you think about today's climate. How many things really are universally adopted? Maybe the inception of a war that everybody agrees upon, or very rare circumstance. But that's the way it was then. So eugenics, again, had the ability to be a unifier with politics and social causes and other movements at a time. But it also all those other courses use eugenics to strengthen their mode too. So it was a fascinating ability to kind of be straight on the middle, and everybody embraced it, despite the political leanings people may have had. Very remarkable, but thank you for your comments. I do appreciate that.
Yeah, I think we have time for one more question here.
Yes.
I remember reading a book in sociology which mentioned the Jukes and the Kallikaks as, that there was, I suppose, a feeble-minded woman or something, and all the descendants were morally depraved. And one other thing, is there a statute in New York which authorizes
Sterilization?
what?
The sterilization?
Yes, that's
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
So the question, by the way, the Jukes and Kallikaks are books. Harry Goddard wrote the Kallikaks, and the Jukes was written by Arthur Estabrook, both tied to the ERO. And they are referenced in the book. These were books of fictional families and studies. They would go to Ulster County, upstate, these rural, poor farming families, and make these studies and use them as a warning to the world. This is what happens if we don't have eugenics. So there was certainly a danger there. The New York sterilization statute was in place from 1912 to 1920. It was repealed, and it was a great disappointment to the ERO, whose home state of New York, and Harry Laughlin said it set us back 10 years, and they were outraged. And then, sure enough, less than 7 years later, Carrie Bruck came. And then that case broke, and now they have the statutory from the highest court in the land to do this. In fact, that court actually compared the sterilization with the compulsory vaccination of smallpox in 1904, the Jacobson case. And by the way, that argument that was made by the Justice, Wendell Holmes, Harry Laughlin provided that in the brief to the lawyer who wrote it and then sent it as a brief to the judge. And of course, the judge adopted that. He said, if we can have compulsory vaccination for smallpox, we could certainly sterilize away. And that was the result.
Well, Mark, I think one of the important roles that we play as a public library is having people like you come and really take us on a deeper dive into our shared history, because it's so important to gain this information and share it with others. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
So thank you very much, Mark. I'm just going to remind folks, we do have books for sale in the back. I encourage you to support Mark's work and help spread this information. So thank you, everybody. Thank you so much, Mark.